what I really want to talk about here is, what does the shop itself need to maximize the shop's ability to help you get your work done? So let's talk about that, okay? And let's start off with space. That's obviously the first thing. Well, we've got a couple different options that we can do when we run out of space in the workshop. Number one is get stuff out of your workshop that doesn't belong in the workshop. Now, we all tend to store things in the workshop that don't belong in the workshop. I've got a wood shelving unit over there behind the camera, and most of the stuff that's on that shelving unit is stuff that has something to do with the work I do in this workshop. But it's still taking up space where I could put tools. If I had another large power tool I needed someplace to put, I'd probably have to move that out so I could put it there. So that's a limiting factor. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding what I call the annex. The annex is a shed out back of the house that was there when we bought the house. It's 12 foot by 18 foot, which is a pretty good sized shed. And it's been a combination of drying room for lumber, or mostly actually logs that I have gathered along the side of the road, and my garden shed. Well, so now what I've done is I've built another garden shed, you know, one of those metal kits, and another shed beside it. That's my garden shed. So I'm moving everything out of the existing shed into there, and I'm turning that shed into the annex. Yeah, I'm still going to be drying some lumber in there, or drying some logs in there, but I've got a table set up that's going to be just a finishing table. I've got my laser engraver set up in there, and I'm going to be setting up a table that's going to be just for either glue ups or doing epoxy fills like river countertops. And that's those operations are all going to be out there. Why are those operations going to be out there? It's really simple. They are non-sawdust operations. I want to get those operations out of this workshop where there's a lot of sawdust. And so by moving them out there, I'm going to not only get a better finish on those, but I'm going to free up space in here, at least a little bit. Okay, I won't have my workbench occupied by an epoxy pour that's got to sit there for 3 days, or something that I've just varnished and I can't do anything else in here because I've got fresh varnish, and you know how varnish attracts sawdust. So that's an issue. What can you do where you are to get more space? Now, a couple of workshops I've had were in the basement, and basements aren't necessarily the best workshop space because they tend to be damp. I had to put a dehumidifier in to be able to use that space. Nevertheless, the nice thing about basements is you usually have a lot of room. And so that's one thing I did. But here's another option. Okay, maybe like me, your workshop is in your garage and you need more space. Do you have basement space that's available that you can move either some storage into or some operations into? You know, I'm looking for places to store things that are currently stored here in the workshop. So even though they're woodworking related, even though they're workshop related, simply because I don't have room for them in here. I've got projects that I've built for Sawnary that are sitting here in this workshop because I haven't found any place else to put them. Eventually, all those are going to be out of here, giving me more room in here. So our first big issue, if we really want to have a good workshop, if we really want to build nice things, is having enough room to do it. And that often means adding to our existing space. So the question to ask yourself is, where can you get that space? And there's 3 basic things. Number 1, find space in your home that isn't currently being utilized. Basement space, attic space, back porch space, things like that. Secondly is, find things that are stored in your workshop that could better be stored elsewhere. Again, that usually means basement, attic, shed, something like that. And thirdly, if you don't need it in the workshop, why is it in there? You know, we all tend to collect things. I have been a tool collector for 50 years. And most of the tools in here I use. But every once in a while I encounter a tool that's stuck in the back corner of a toolbox, and I go, why did I save this thing? And I'll get rid of it. I'll find somebody that can use it, or I'll find a trash can that can use it. Because if it's not being used, it's just taking up space. So, step 1 in making a better workshop is getting yourself more space and better utilized space. That means organizing the space well so it's easy for you to work in. The next thing we want to do to improve our shop or make ourselves a great shop is have good storage. Now, I'm sure you've got some sort of storage in your workshop as it is, just like I do. But I found that storage is one of those things you can always improve upon. You know, there's two basic categories of things you really need to consider storing in your workshop. Number one is tools, and the other is materials. Now, there's a lot of other things that can end up falling into this, like hardware. You know, hardware are materials, but they're not lumber, okay? So there's a lot of different things we can be dealing with when we're talking about tools and hardware, or tools and materials, I should say, okay? I have found that you're better off storing your materials, specifically your lumber, on edge. Store it standing up, not laying down. Now, I know there's times that you may need to store it laying down, and I actually have some lumber here in my workshop that's up on brackets on the wall and stored horizontally. But I try and avoid doing that. And the reason I try and avoid doing that is I don't want lumber that is going to warp. And putting it up on brackets, if the brackets are too far apart, gives it the opportunity to warp. Now, here's a little trick. If you've got to put it up on brackets, stand it on edge on those brackets instead of laying it flat. Laying it flat, you got the weight is going to try and make it sag. Putting it up on edge, it's really hard for it to do it. Just the basic mechanics of it doesn't allow it to really warp. And so that's one way to handle that situation. But if you stand it on edge, like I've done with most of my material in here, you find that you've got a way that nothing's going to happen to it. It really doesn't warp on edge. Now, when I say on edge, that means really on edge, standing vertically, not leaning against a wall. I've built a rack here in my workshop that has lumber standing in it vertically, and it's pretty vertical, okay? Every once in a while, I'll bring some lumber in, and I've got to set it someplace temporarily, and yes, it will lean against the wall. But you know, I found that lumber can warp in as little as a day if it's leaning against the wall, so you really want to watch out for that. Normally, if I bring lumber in and I'm not putting it away or cutting it up right away, I'll try and lay it on my workbench. Matter of fact, a lot of times before I start filming, I've got to move stuff off the workbench that I've laid here temporarily because I'm not ready to use it yet, and then when I get done, I put it back here. I'd rather keep my workbench clear, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. Now, what about tools, though? Tools are usually the bigger problem because I don't know about you, but I don't keep a lot of lumber in my workshop. I keep maybe 20 to 30 board feet max of lumber in here, and that's including various different sizes of lumber, okay, and different types of lumber. I'll buy lumber as I need it, and now that's kind of tricky because I have to get hardwood shipped in here, and so what that means is I might buy 10 board feet of a particular hardwood or a couple different hardwoods. Usually the ones I have, most likely I have here are walnut and maple, you know, and I have a little bit of oak. But oak, if I absolutely have to get it, I can go to Harbor Freight or Lowe's to get it, whereas the others I can't. So, you know, it's kind of a trade-off thing. What can I get and what can I get? Pine, on the other hand, I can get readily. So, yeah, I keep some pine because it's something I use all the time, but I don't keep a lot of it. So, the lumber isn't really the big issue. The big issue for me is my tools, and I've got lots of tools. Now, there's two basic schools of thought about where to put your tools. One is to put them in toolboxes, and the other is to hang them on the wall. And amongst the toolboxes, that can be split down into people that use mechanics type toolboxes, which is what I've got here in my workshop, or a tool chest. And I've seen some absolutely gorgeous tool chests that people have made. I've also seen tool chests or cabinets that hang on the wall, say behind the workbench, that people make that are absolutely gorgeous. I don't have the patience for that. And I've got too many other projects going to invest the time in making one of those. But on the other hand, that tool cabinet hanging on the wall, or even the tools hanging on the wall, is a great way of keeping your tools accessible. So what I do, and this is what I recommend to just about anybody, is to use a combination. Don't go for one size fits all. Okay? You know, I have a machinist and a mechanics actually roll around toolbox, hold hand tools of various different types, a few small power tools, but mostly hand tools, as well as things like some small clamps, abrasives, and other materials or supplies that are used. But they're not things that I'm using all the time. They're not things that I'm grabbing all the time. The stuff I grab all the time, I try and put out where I've got it accessible. Like there was a project I did here a couple months ago where I built a small tool board, kind of like a miniature tool wall, that's attached to one end of my workbench, which is where I have most of my measurement tools. Why there? Because those are the things I'm grabbing all the time. And so I put some convenient, it's right there where I can get it. I don't have to go hunting for it. Because the workbench is centrally located, I can grab those pretty much from anywhere in the shop without having to take more than a few steps. Okay? I have other tools that are stored in other places on the walls. For example, my lathe, there's a small tool board on the wall above the lathe where I've got chucks, plates, live centers, tool rests, and even a pair of calipers on there. And those are tools that I use regularly with the lathe. It doesn't have my chisels on there because I haven't found the way, I haven't come to a conclusion on exactly how I want to put my chisels. And they're probably not going to go on the wall, they're probably going to go on the stand. But again, it's where can I put it where it's quick and easy to grab? I have saws right here on the side of this toolbox, and they're held there with magnets because those are the saws I use all the time, and that's an easy way to get them. Above them, I've got a rack with screwdrivers. On the other side of the toolbox, I've got a rack with hammers. It isn't right here at my workbench, but it's 3 steps away, and I've got them. I don't have to open a drawer. So tool storage is one of your biggest issues to make your shop workable. How can you put your tools so that they are convenient and ready to use, but yet at the same time, they're not in your way? You know, if I had those roll-around toolboxes right behind me here, yeah, it might make an impressive backdrop, but it also means that I don't have access to these tools. I might have to put them in a more inconvenient location. So one of the things you can really do to make the most out of your workshop space, however much you have, and improve or upgrade your workshop is work on your tool storage. You know, this is something I'm working on all the time. Just last weekend, I moved where I was storing my handheld sanders to put them in a more convenient location where they're closer to my workbench. They're out, they're in a rack that holds them, so even if it's still, the sander's still going when I set down, it's going to stay there. It's just going to bounce around a little square. Okay, so that's a thing I did for convenience sake. Here on my workbench, I mentioned about the rack there. I've also got a rack here where I've got my bench chisels, because that's something you use all the time, and so it's right there where I can grab it. One of these days I'm going to do something similar for planes, but I haven't done it yet because there's a couple more planes I want to add to my collection before I really do that. Okay? So think about that storage. Now, let me say one more thing about lumber storage, and that is lumber doesn't absolutely have to be stored in your workshop. Now, it's recommended that you allow your lumber 48 hours in the workshop to acclimate before you use it, okay, before you start working on a project with it. And that's a great idea so that the temperature and humidity match that of the workshop. But what about other lumber you've got? What if you've got excess lumber that isn't something you're working with right now? Okay, well, that could be stored elsewhere. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I've got some lumber out in my annex. Okay, why is it out there? Because I'm not going to use it anytime soon. And so by keeping it out there, I've got in a good place where it's there. I've actually got stacked and stickered, okay? And when I need it, it'll be available. In the meantime, it's not in here taking up space I need. The next thing I'd like to recommend as far as an upgrade for your workshop is workbench space. Now, I've run across very few people that have enough workbench space. Matter of fact, the only ones I can say that I've seen their workshops and I'd say, yeah, they probably have enough, are people that have really big workshops and are professionals that do it all the time. And one of the things those professionals have learned is that they have to leave things on their workbench, so when that happens, they need another workbench they can work on. And some of these guys you see on YouTube where they're doing a lot of projects and stuff, they may have 3 or 4 workbenches in their workshop. And I'm talking about good-sized work tables. Maybe they're not woodworkers' workbenches with vices and things like that, but they're work surfaces, okay? I currently have 3 workbenches, or 3 areas that can be considered workbenches here in this workshop. And even that sometimes isn't enough. And let me explain what they are. First of all, I've got my old workbench. Now, before this workshop, the last couple workshops I had, my workbench consisted of a science teacher's cart, you know, the kind that they did, high school science teachers would do experiments on in front of the class. It measures 2.5 feet by 4 foot, or we could say 30 inches by 48 inches. It's got a cabinet built in underneath, and that's where a lot of my handheld power tools are stored. And that was all I had for a workbench. And it served me well. I had it for several years, but it wasn't big enough. And I still have it. It sits at the end of this workbench, kind of the back of it to the end of this workbench. And I use it predominantly for repairing tools, or other things. Say I've got to sharpen my chainsaw blade, for example. I'll do it there. Or I have to repair an electric drill that the trigger switch went out on. I've got to replace it. Or my wife's vacuum cleaner or whatever. That's what I predominantly use that for. Often it's got projects in process sitting on it that I have to get back to, usually smaller projects. Then I've got a workbench along the wall, which isn't really used so much to work on. It's predominantly a place for some of my, what we would call bench-mounted power tools. It's got my belt sander, my oscillating spindle sander, and my scroll saw mounted to it. And the rest of the space often ends up being places where I put parts. You go to the hardware store, you come back with a bag of parts, you got to put it somewhere. So I don't put it on this, I'll put it on that. So I'm constantly fighting to keep that space clean. But if I need to work on it, there are a couple of areas on that workbench that are large enough that I can work on something small on them. Or I could do a clamp up and set it on that bench. And so it is workbench space. And of course my main workbench is this one right here, which is 3 feet by 8 feet. And I built it in the shop with the intent of it being my main workbench. Now I have to say, when I built it, I had no idea I was going to be doing all these videos, and I really didn't build that with that in mind. I built it to be a space for me to work, and part of the reason it is so big is because one of the projects I'm going to do is build some custom doors for my home, specifically the front door and the side door. Doors are expensive. You get a hardwood door, you're looking at a couple grand easily. Well, that's something you can make yourself. And so I built this workbench with that type of project in mind, also with tabletops in mind. So that's why it is so big. That's convenient because if you ever really see this workbench, there's always a pile of stuff at that end and a pile of stuff at that end. So even though it's 8 feet long, I really have about 6 feet of usable space, which for most of the projects I do, that's fine. Every once in a while I'm working on something bigger and I got to clear everything off. So I've got the whole workbench. But if you don't have multiple workbenches in your workshop, you're probably fighting the problem of having stuff piled on the workspace that you need to be working. And that's really, if those other 2 workbenches don't do anything for me but keep stuff off of this workbench, they're doing their job. Now, like I said, I use them for other things. But for example, like having those bench-mounted power tools on that bench against the wall keeps them off of this workbench. Now, I see a lot of guys that build workbenches and they have the table saw built in, they have their miter saw built in, and I'm not saying that's bad. All I'm saying is they don't have a large work area, or they've taken up a large part of that large work area by mounting tools. For my needs, I decided it was better to have that on a separate workbench. Okay, you got to decide what works for you. Every one of us has to decide what do we need for ourselves. But by and large, most people need more workbench space than they have. Now let me say this, most workbenches don't have to be fancy. This workbench, I put a little more money into it, a little more effort into it. The top is 2 1/4 inches thick. As you can see, it's got bench toggle holes, it's got vices attached to it, things like that. But not all my workbenches have that. Not all of them need to be. My finishing bench out in the annex is a 2x4 frame with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood on top. That's it. I don't need it to be any fancier than that. I don't need it to be any heavier duty than that. I don't need vices built into it. I don't need bench toggle holes. All I need is someplace I can set something that I am finishing, and that's what it is. Okay. Sometimes if I've got a concern about the finish sticking the item to the bench top, I'll put down some wax paper, or I may put the object up on little stands. I don't buy the commercial pyramid ones. What I do is I take a little piece of 2x2 or 1x2, cut 2 inches long, so I've got a little square, and drive a finishing nail through it. So I've got a nail sticking up there, and that's what I stand things on. Okay. Sometimes I'll put down a drop cloth if I feel I need to. But that bench is very, very simple. It costs less than $100 to build, and it gives me an area that's about 4 feet long by about 3 feet deep that I can finish a lot of different projects on it. So benches don't have to be fancy and they don't have to be expensive. They just have to be functional. This bench needs to be a little more functional than that, because I do things where I need the bench dog holes, where I need the vices. That bench, I don't need those things. The bench against the wall, I don't need those things. Because all that it is storage for parts, and it's a place to mount those tools. So I don't need the same things I need with this bench. So if you only have one workbench, I'd highly recommend give yourself some more bench space if you've got the room for it, and you'll find it'll make it a whole lot easier to work. The next thing I want to mention as far as improving your workshop is lighting. Now, I gotta say, I have been really bad about lighting through most of my woodworking years. I went with whatever was in the workshop, and that usually meant, since it was probably in a garage, a little light fixture up on the ceiling with a 100-watt bulb, and I try and put my workbench under that, and that's it. That's what I got. And that's not enough. When I built this workbench, the first thing I did is put a couple of those screw-in type light fixtures. I've got like 3 or 4 wings with LEDs, and that helped some, but it was very centralized. Now, what I have right now is I still have those, plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They look like the dual fluorescent tubes, but they're actually LED fixtures in here, and I've got light everywhere. And I found that the light makes it easier to work. Now, maybe that's a little bit because I'm getting older and my eyes aren't as good, but there's an awful lot of times when you've got a lot of detail, or you've got something you're working on that you need to be able to see the detail of what you're doing. And good lighting makes all the difference in the world. And it actually doesn't cost all that much money to do. Now, these fixtures that I've got here, I think I paid somewhere around $60 or $70 for 8 of them, okay? Buying them on Amazon, which really wasn't that bad a deal. And like I said, I've got light everywhere. All of my major tools have good lighting, and all of my workbenches have good lighting. And so no matter what I'm doing, I've got good lighting available to me. Good lighting is also safer because you can see things better. You're less likely to make a mistake where a tool slips because you got your hand in the wrong position because you're not seeing things as well. And I'm not saying that your workspace right now is dark. What I'm saying is it could be better. And I have found that more lighting not only makes it easier to work, but it makes it safer to work. Okay? Again, you don't have to spend a fortune to do this. And my wife bugs me all the time because there's wires running all over the place on the ceiling here. She thinks I should have taken and run the wires above the ceiling to go from one light fixture to the other, but I didn't. I put the cup hooks in the ceiling and I attached the wires to that, which doesn't look great, but it's safe, okay? They're all going into an electrical outlet. It's not like they're hardwired, so I don't need to go through the trouble of going up above the ceiling. But having the lights at every single tool, well, this is what you want to be looking for. You want to stand in front of the tool like you're going to be using it and say, how well can I see what I'm doing? Then you want to take a light and just temporarily place it there and see how much of a difference does it make. And if it really makes a difference where you can say, oh my gosh, I can see what I'm doing better, you need a light. Simple, okay? If it really doesn't make a difference, okay, maybe you can put that light elsewhere in your workshop. But good lighting is a big deal and makes working a whole lot easier. Since we're on the subject of lighting, let me mention something else that goes hand in hand with lighting, and that is your electrical power, okay? Now, your average American home has one 20-amp circuit running into your garage. And I'm assuming that your workshop's going to be in your garage. Maybe it isn't, but I'll use that as the example, okay? One 20-amp circuit. Now, if you're in your basement, you may only have a 15-amp circuit, so you got less power. Basically, what that means is you have enough power to run one major power tool at a time. And really, that's all you run, so that's not a big deal. However, we do more in our workshop than just run those major power tools. We have lighting to consider, and granted, LED lighting doesn't require that much electricity, but it is drawing some. We have dust collection to consider, okay? We may have air filters. I've got an air filter hanging up here that's drawing sawdust out of the air. And you may have heating and air conditioning. So all those things are considerations. Early this year, about 8 months ago, I ran a new line from my main breaker box into the workshop, and I put a 60-amp service in here. So I essentially have 3 circuits. I have my original circuit is one of those 3, and because it's now coming off of that 60-amp breaker box, and it's running all over the place, and it's the primary power for my major power tools. Okay, again, I only run one at a time. I have a second circuit that's running in here that is just running my mini split. Okay, and I have a third circuit that is my lighting and dust collection. So in other words, when I turn on, say, my power planer, which draws a fair amount of current, and I turn on dust collection at the same time, I don't have to worry about tripping the breaker because it's two different circuits. Right? That's what I'm talking about, getting enough power. You don't want to be on the fringe of popping a circuit breaker. Not only does that mean you're putting your home in danger, it also means that you're putting your projects in danger, because if the power drops when you're in the middle of a cut or planing something or whatever, you may end up with a bad spot that you've just messed up that you're going to have to fix. Okay? So yeah, does it cost money? Yes, it does. I spent $400 just on the wire to get the circuits in here. Copper wire has gotten very expensive. The breaker box, by comparison, was cheap. I think it was 40 bucks. But I paid $400 for the wire I needed to get what I need in here. It is a bit of an investment, but again, it's worth it. Now, I don't have any 220 in here at all. Okay? That would be a totally separate issue. If we get to that point, I'm going to have to run more wire to get 220 in here. All I've got is 110. I don't have any tools that are big enough to need 220, and really I'm not expecting to get any. But if something happens, yeah, I'm going to have to spend some more money and run some more wire. A moment ago, I mentioned putting a mini split here in my workshop, and that is one of the upgrades I highly recommend that you do in your own workshop. Of course, a lot depends on where you live. Now, I live in South Texas, where we get 4 or 5 months of the year where the days top 100 degrees every day. And I'd have a real hard time filming these videos in here if I had sweat pouring off of me while I was trying to do it. Okay, so I installed a mini split. Now, that was a bit of investment. That's what prompted me to put in the other electrical lines, which I wanted to do anyway. But all told, I've got, including paying my AC guy, because I had him put in instead of doing it myself, I've got close to $2,000 invested in doing that. All right, you can do it cheaper. You can buy a mini split for $500 or $600 and put it in yourself. There's nothing about them that you can't do yourself. The main reason I had him do it is I knew what would happen if I said I was going to do it myself. It would sit there for 6 months before I got it done, just because I got too many projects going on. Okay. The mini split not only provides me with air conditioning, it provides me with heating in the wintertime. Now, winter is no big deal here, but some parts of the country it really is. If you can't use your workshop year-round, then there's something wrong. That's really what I'm trying to say here. Okay. Make it possible. Now, I'll have to say my mini split has a hard time keeping up with the heat because my garage here is not insulated. That's going to have to be another project down the road here, is I'm going to have to somehow insulate this without tearing my whole garage apart to do so. Okay, that probably means blown in insulation in the walls or something like that. I intend to replace my overhead garage door with carriage house doors, and I'm working on a design where I can insulate those when I do that, so that I'll have that insulation too, because that's just, right now it's just a sheet of aluminum, and that's nothing as far as insulation is concerned. So making a comfortable work area is valuable. And of course, the more time you spend in it, the more valuable it is. If you have any thought about trying to make a living off of woodworking, or even as a side gig where you're going to make some money, you want to make it so you're going to be comfortable working in your workshop whenever. And that means heating and air conditioning. Yes, that's a big investment. Of everything I'm talking about here, that's your biggest investment. In the long run, it's worth it. One last thing I want to talk about here as far as a workshop upgrade, and that is dust collection. Now, historically, I've been very bad at dust collection, and I'm still pretty bad about it, okay? My big problem here is I really don't have room to put in a big dust collection system. So what I've got is I've got a couple small portable dust collection systems and a couple small shop vacs, and they're localized dust collection for some of my biggest sawdust makers. Like I've got one that's attached to my planer. I've got one that's attached to my router table. I've got a small shop vac attached to my table saw. Okay, so I'm not collecting all my sawdust, but I'm at least collecting a chunk of it. Dust is part of woodworking. Sawdust is just something we generate. Okay, but you can end up with that sawdust causing problems, both for your health because you're breathing it in, and for your projects because you get sawdust into the finish. So yeah, dust collection is valuable, and it'll save you the time of having to run around cleaning everything up. I did a project here a couple days ago, and I was flattening a cookie with my router, using the router as a planer, and I was flattening a cookie that I had cut with off of a mesquite log, and there was about 1.5 inches of difference from one side to the other. And I probably produced about 10 gallons of sawdust doing that. Maybe only 5. But I'm still cleaning up sawdust from that. You look at my other workbench over there, it's all got red dust all over it that I still haven't cleaned up from that. You look at the floor on the other side of my workbench here, and there's a whole bunch of sawdust still there. So the more dust collection you have, the less time you have to spend cleaning things up. At the same time, it makes your shop safer, because all that sawdust on the floor can create an uneven, unsteady surface to walk on. And there's also the hassle that goes with it. So eventually, I will expand this garage, I hope. And when I do, I will put in some real dust collection. But in the meantime, I actually don't have any place that I can set a dust collection system and run the piping all over the place like people do. So that's a future plan for me. But if you can put it into your workshop, if you have the space and you have the funds to do it, I highly recommend putting in a good dust collection system. So there we have it. There's 7 different things that I'm recommending as workshop upgrades. So, okay, you're not going to get them all done this week. You're not going to get them all done this year. That's all right. This is a process. It's a process. I've been at woodworking for 50 years, and you know something? I'm still buying tools. I'm still finding better ways of storing them. I'm still finding better ways of doing things. I'm still rearranging my workshop. It's a process that never ends, because we're always learning more, and as we learn more, we can apply what we've learned to making not only our workshop better, but our projects better too.